The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 5. Natures and Puppets. Chapter 2. Liberty is Dead. It is a belief that has never been formulated, but it is at the root of a great deal of behavior today, that freedom and irresponsibility are invariably commutative terms. The first object of a person with an ambition to be free, and yet possessing none of the means exterior to himself or herself, such as money, conspicuous ability, or power, to obtain freedom, is to avoid responsibility. Absence of responsibility, an automatic and stereotyped rhythm, is what men most desire for themselves. All struggle has for its end relief or repose. A rhythmic movement is restful, but consciousness and possession of the self is not compatible with a set rhythm. All the libertarian cries of a century ago were based on unreal premises, and impulses that are not natural to, and cannot be sustained by, the majority of men. Luxury and repose are what most men undeniably desire. They would like to be as much at rest as if they were dead, and as active and alive as passivity will allow. When action is required of them, they prefer that it should be exciting and sensational, or else that it should have a strongly defined, easily grasped, mechanical rhythm. The essential fatigue and poorness of most organisms, and the minds that serve them, is displayed in nothing so much as in this sensationalism. Every low-grade animal is to some extent born sadic, for that is the only way he can feel. Sensationalism and sadism are twins. The only effort that is acceptable to many people is violent, excessive, and spasmodic action. Simple delights, as we call them, appear to be the privileged possession of the chosen ones of nature. All the old libertarian claim was for a liberty involving the opposite of all this. Consciousness and responsibility are prose as contrasted with the poetry of passive, more or less ecstatic, rhythmic, mechanical life. There is, therefore, the intoxicated dance of puppets, and besides that the few natures, as they were called by Gouda, moving unrhythmically, or according to a rhythm of their own, which is the same thing. The conventional libertarianism of a century ago envisaged this latter form of personal freedom, this prose of the individual, as it could be called. The libertarianism of today rejects with horror the idea of that independence. In place of this prose of the individual, it desires the poetry of the mass, in place of the rhythm of the person, the rhythm of the crowd. The extreme expression of this desire is the Jesuit ideal of self-annihilating obedience, so that the adept becomes a disinterested machine, ecstatically obedient, delighted to find himself entirely in the power of another person, his superior in will and vitality. The very principle of authority is his bride. That is the release of ecstasy, absolute repose of the will, which, with the generality of men, require a great deal of rest, also complete abandon of the principle of self, which is the principle of effort too, and the cause of all suffering. The apathy of the Stoics was also intended to secure this rest. If the traditional idea of liberty, or what is to be free, is no longer satisfactory, but if really freedom is perhaps the opposite of what the grands etc. were persuaded it was, then revolution will tomorrow have a different meaning, though by no means a less revolutionary one. If that notion of freedom were indeed imposed on people by philosophers, or by ambitious rulers just as a very restless, active man's idea of an enjoyable afternoon's entertainment, incapable, as such active men usually are, of putting himself in other people's shoes, might be imposed on a sluggish party, or a very intellectual person's notion of a jolly evening's relaxation imposed on a gathering of friends, snobbishly adapting themselves to his vigorous highbrow appetites, then the sooner this mistake is corrected the better, or, since this is under correction, for these betters are not naturally the object of my interest, perhaps at least that may be so. But there is another consideration here, that is, that people have found this out for themselves, who can doubt it? For they certainly do not behave any longer as though they were under the old delusion. Far from behaving in that way, they seem to have embraced the new, and much more true, idea of freedom, if anything too indiscriminatingly. It is easy to foresee that before long people may have actually to be warned off this more recently appreciated form of freedom, which formerly they would, under the influence of early libertarian, Saturnalian excitement, have described as slavery. It is possible yet that masses of people, many of them big strong men, will have to be warned off and driven away from the flesh pots of feminine submission. They may have to be prodded by lictors to prevent them from sinking into a lascivious coma, and told not to be such naughty little slaves. That is at least a situation that the responsible authorities may have on their hands, unless the ruler is to be surfeited with submissiveness, and find his occupation, that of ruling, gone, or grown very unexciting. What a peculiar fanatic of energy, professor of energy, as Stendhal called himself, the liberty-obsessed personage seems today. The more indignantly humanitarian he is, the more sturdily he swells his chest and points to ancient liberties, and the more he whips himself into a rage at the thought of the monstrous, disgraceful enslavement of mankind, the more he almost seems like an agent and emissary of the despot, as of course in the first instance he was, putting a little spirit into the cattle to be ruled. In the times when the herd was wilder and more unruly, he had to pretend to lead them to the attack, misleading them, back to their pens and corrals, instead. He is without any function today, but he often looks as though it were his function to stimulate the jaded performers. Like wildfire, since the termination of the war, the truth about freedom seems to have flown from mind to mind. It has not been formulated or appeared in words. It is a secret. It is even in the nature of a rather dirty secret, nonetheless, I am afraid, appreciated for all that. With an immense sigh of relief it has been learnt that all personal effort, after all, is vain, that the notion of liberty was, by those who wished to impose it on men, a program of monstrous heroism, a labor of Hercules, a colossal burden, to no purpose. Not the word, but the thought, has gone round, of immense acceptance, of the end of struggle. Liberty was a nightmare like death. That at length has been perceived. It is a weight off every mind today that it is dead, for death once dead, there is no more dying then. The enemy of the human race, liberty, is dead, and men are free once more. But at once, naturally, they begin to abuse this freedom, especially men, for women have always to some extent possessed it. So the great revolutionary afflatus, the plough of science that has gone across the necropolis of the past, the sudden opening up of the whole earth to its children, has turned out to be something of a more prodigious nature than was at first supposed, or is yet much understood, more truly new and revolutionary, for Europe at least, than anyone would have thought, watching the first, aggressive, libertarian mobs, with their Phrygian caps and cockades. Let us, now that we are acquainted with this secret of our contemporaries, examine it, still warm from the bosoms from which we have wrenched or otherwise secured it. We shall see that it is the first genuine philosophy of slaves that has ever been formulated. Christianity, with its aggressiveness towards authority, and its insistence on a new law as opposed to the old law, was misrepresented by Nietzsche. It was, if a philosophy of slaves who desired to rule some day, and to discredit power. The present is very different. It consists in an exploitation of the joys of slavery and submission. How enjoyable to be a slave! The really sensible woman must often have said, lazily awaiting her lord and master. How divine to have a master! How delightful to have everything done for one, and everything done to one, and have to do nothing oneself. Dolce far niente. How happy I am! That, sometimes minus the sensuality, and sometimes with it, is what the new discoverers of freedom have said. It has led, of course, to inversely libertarian excesses. But the mind of the world is easier today than it has been for a long while. I am speaking of the European world. So far so good, we must all agree. Many difficulties, however, occur in the way of the realization of this new dream. It is not certain that it is any more practicable than the other. Perhaps the world has sighed with relief too soon. Also the abandon displayed by many people in enrolling themselves in this new, as it were, secret host is open to objection. Let us at all events examine this esoteric theory of life without fear and without favor.